Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're doing something that is honestly pretty fascinating. If you've ever watched the news and felt like you were completely missing the deeper framework behind the headlines regarding the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, well, this is for you. We are going to strictly and impartially unpack a highly complex, theology-based manifesto. And just to be clear up front, we aren't taking sides or endorsing any of these viewpoints. We're simply taking a magnifying glass to the source documents to discover exactly how these hardline arguments are constructed from the ground up. Okay, let's take a quick look at our roadmap for today. We'll start with 1, the divine estate framework, move into 2, the resident alien protocol, explore 3, historical clashes, tackle 4, confronting the secular left, followed by 5, countering populist narratives, and finally wrap things up with 6, case study, media fact check. Let's get right into it. Section 1, the divine estate framework. To really grasp this whole worldview, we have to start by establishing the foundational axiom of the Source Manifesto. So the manifesto builds its entire argument on a concept it calls absolute divine monarchism. It basically argues that secular institutions and international bodies are making a massive category error when they try to arbitrate borders here. Why? Well, because according to this document, modern international law has absolutely zero jurisdiction over what it strictly defines as the creator's private property. To really anchor this idea, the author points straight to the book of Leviticus. The core assertion here is that God is literally the sole landlord of the estate. In this view, the land isn't some common commodity that's subject to human treaties or democratic self-determination. Instead, it's leased by the monarch, who alone retains the absolute right of eviction. Now, you might be wondering, how does this ultimate landlord actually operate down here on Earth? Enter the shaliach, which is a Hebrew term for a corporate agent. In strict legal terms, an agent acts as the principal themselves, right? So the text argues that when Israel executes commands to reclaim land or subdue hostile forces, it is acting with the monarch's full legal immunity. This essentially bypasses human ethical metrics altogether, placing the moral accountability for any action entirely on the sovereign who ordered it. Moving right along to Section 2, the resident alien protocol. Let's see how this foundational axiom dictates exactly how conquered populations are managed. The source lays out 2 very stark, mutually exclusive frameworks found in the ancient text. The first is Sherem, which mandates complete demographic erasure of an enemy to protect the land from spiritual contamination. However, and this is a really crucial distinction in the text, the author notes this absolute destruction mandate was judicially paused by the monarch early in history. Because it's frozen, the text forces a default to the second option, the resident alien or Ger Toshav protocol. Now, this default protocol, it's intensely strict. We're talking total political disenfranchisement, meaning no voting, no need of status, and complete demilitarization. The conquered population has to conform to baseline universal laws, known as Noahide laws. But importantly, the text points out this same framework explicitly forbids lawless abuse or state slavery. It requires the absolute gold standard of objective judicial fairness and identical weights and measures, specifically to protect the resident alien from arbitrary oppression. Okay, Section 3, historical and theological clashes. Let's transition to how this specific worldview interprets modern historical timelines and competing theologies. This is really interesting. The document forcefully pushes back on the modern claim that Arab hostilities were just a defensive reaction to Israeli expansion in the late 1940s. The manifesto maps out a fact-based timeline of violence starting way back in the 1920s and 30s. It argues that physical hostilities and attempts to halt Jewish immigration began decades before Israel possessed a single tank, a military border, or a state administration. So why do secular political compromises always seem to hit a brick wall here? Well, the text points to a competing absolute framework. In classical Islamic jurisprudence, once a territory falls under Islamic rule, it becomes a waqf. Think of it like an eternal, inalienable religious trust belonging exclusively to the global Muslim community. Therefore, the source notes, no human leader actually has the religious authority to cede even an inch of it to non-Muslim sovereignty. Because of that, the source argues that the reestablishment of the State of Israel completely upended this traditional structure, creating what it calls an inversion of the divine hierarchy. Jewish political supremacy over historic Islamic land is viewed as a massive theological transgression, which then triggers a mandatory defensive jihad. According to the text, this creates a scorched earth mandate where permanent ruin and constant warfare are vastly preferred by the resistance over a peaceful landscape shared with a sovereign Jewish state. To put things into perspective, the source brings up a staggering demographic data point. Following the 1947 UN partition plan, somewhere between 850,000 to 900,000 Jews were systematically purged from their ancient communities across Arab nations like Iraq, Egypt, and Syria. The author uses this to illustrate the inverse table test, arguing that if an Arab Islamic state had conquered the land in 1948, the complete displacement and subjugation of Jews would have been viewed by the surrounding nations as a perfectly just and righteous historical outcome. Which brings us to Section 4, Confronting the Secular Left. The explainer now shifts gears to how the manifesto aggressively refutes modern Western critics, specifically targeting critical social justice theory. The text methodically goes after these left-wing ideological pillars one by one. Calling it a settler colonialist's project, the text points to archaeological evidence of an indigenous Jewish presence and the fact that over 50% of Israel's Jewish population are refugees from Arab lands, not Europe. It attacks the intersectional argument as sheer Western projection, noting the left aligns itself with Islamist movements that legally subjugate women and explicitly deny LGBTQ+ rights. Finally, it argues the chant "from the river to the sea" is absolutely not a call for democracy, but just a sanitized PR mask for a genocidal mandate literally written into the charters of local terror groups. To counter atheistic critics, the author tries to box them in with what they call a philosophical checkmate, or presuppositional trap. It goes like this. An atheist who believes the universe is just random matter cannot logically account for absolute universal moral laws. If morality is just subjective brain chemistry, then the strong conquering the weak is literally just natural selection. The text asserts you cannot deny God's existence while simultaneously borrowing his absolute immaterial moral standards to condemn his people's actions. All right, moving to Section 5, Countering Populist Narratives. The manifesto certainly doesn't just critique the left. It also targets fringe right-wing populist commentators and isolationists. The source takes on claims by commentators like white supremacist Nick Fuentes, who argue that Jews are somehow enemies of Christian civilization. The text totally refutes this, pointing out that Western Christian civilization is fundamentally built on Judeo-Christian roots. The author calls this populist ideology a theological inversion, essentially a repackaging of medieval tribal paganism disguised as Christian orthodoxy that directly contradicts the New Testament. It also calls out claims from commentators like Candace Owens, who the text claims frames Israel as a demonic state and points to the Star of David as proof of occult practices. The manifesto completely dismisses these claims as paranoid delusions and a literal resurrection of ancient supernatural scapegoating. It points out a very concrete counter-reality. Instead of secretly orchestrating global terror, Israel actually spends its entire budget and intelligence apparatus defending itself against those very regional Islamist terror forces. And finally, Section 6, Case Study, Media Fact Check. Let's look at a concrete case study provided in the source materials, a detailed fact check of a February 2026 Tucker Carlson interview regarding Christians in the Holy Land. In the interview, Carlson claims the Christian population in Israel is shrinking. Well, the fact check directly contradicts this with hard census data, pointing out that the Christian population has actually grown by roughly 500% inside Israel's sovereign borders, jumping from around 35,000 in 1948 to over 184,000 today. The text labels the headline statistic demonstrably false. The analysis then really breaks down the logical sleight of hand going on with the other claims. It argues the interview takes the very real, well-documented Christian decline in Palestinian Authority-administered areas like Bethlehem and silently shifts the blame over to Israel, totally omitting the roles of PA governance failure and Islamist extremist pressure. It notes that while fringe-spitting incidents by extremists are real, comparing them to al-Qaeda is just a false analogy. And it clarifies that barring an Israeli citizen archbishop from Gaza is a blanket citizenship-based wartime security measure, absolutely not religious persecution. So, the final verdict? The fact-checker concludes that this media narrative isn't necessarily built on totally invented statistics. Instead, it relies on distorting true, isolated facts. By oversimplifying causes, making hasty generalizations, and deliberately omitting key context, the interview creates a highly emotional narrative that materially misleads the audience about the true, complex realities and the real causes behind Christian hardship in the region. As we wrap up this explainer today, the source documents leave us with one massive, overarching question to think about. If critics from both ends of the spectrum, the atheistic left and the populist right, must borrow concepts of universal, transcendent justice to make their arguments, whose absolute laws are they actually invoking? It's a profound thought. We invite you to ponder this deep intersection of ancient theology and modern geopolitics. Thanks for diving into this complex framework with us today, and remember to keep questioning the narratives behind the headlines.